Wyoming Territory, 1879. The wind came hard off the plains that morning, dragging dust through the ghosted remains of a mining camp east of Laramie. And Frances Harlow stood in its teeth with her skirts whipping around her boots, shoulders squared against the world. They had just taken her children. The judge never looked her in the eye when he said it. Just stamped the paper and told her she was unfit for any man, and therefore unfit to raise her own. No husband, no kin, no roof that did not leak. She watched her two boys, Jesse, age 6, and little Jonah, get loaded into the back of a wagon bound for some church-run home in Cheyenne. They cried. She did not. She had done all her crying the night before. Now, with nothing left but a patched carpetbag and a life's worth of shame, Frances walked until her boots blistered and the sun dropped behind the scrub hills. She did not look back. When the cowboy found her, she was sitting on a flat stone beside the dry riverbed, hands slack in her lap, eyes fixed on nothing. She heard the hoofbeats first, then the slow creak of leather as he dismounted. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not ask what she was doing there alone. He just sat down beside her. Frances looked sideways, half expecting judgment in his face, maybe pity. But he said nothing, just sat there, brown hat pushed back on his head, the wind catching the edge of his coat. He stayed like that, quiet as dusk, not looking at her, not looking away. "Do you need something?" she asked after a while, her voice hoarse from dust. "No," he said. They sat for another long stretch of silence. Then he turned, just slightly, and said, "You look like you got left behind." Frances let out a tight breath that might have been a laugh, or maybe a sob trying to disguise itself. "You could say that." He nodded. "Well, I do not leave folks behind." His name was Hollis Shepard, a cattleman. Born in Kansas, rode west at 19, rode further still until he stopped chasing things and started keeping them. He had a quiet way about him, like a man who did not waste words because he had felt the full weight of them once. "I got a cabin," he said that evening, still seated beside her. "Few miles north. Not much, but it is dry and you will not be cold. You can stay there if you want." She turned to him, brows drawn. "Why would you offer me that? I do not like seeing folks thrown away." Frances did not trust Easy. Not anymore. But something in his voice sat quiet inside her, like a promise not made out loud. She stood, stiff from sitting too long, and nodded once. "All right." They rode double on his bay mare, her arms loose around his middle, her cheek against his back, though she did not let herself rest. Not yet. The cabin was small but solid. A one-room structure with a potbelly stove, a table, and a bed pushed against the far wall. Hollis lit the lamp and handed her a blanket, then started cooking beans without saying much. The silence between them was not awkward. It was something else, something that let her keep her dignity. "You can take the bed," he said when the meal was done. "I will sleep outside." "You do not have to." "I know." He stepped out into the night without another word, and she stood by the door for a long time after, blanket clutched in her hands, heart heavy with something she could not name. The next morning, she found him splitting wood behind the cabin, shirt sleeves rolled, jaw set, hand steady. He looked up when she stepped outside, but did not speak. She walked over, took another axe leaning against the stump, and brought it down on a log with more anger than skill. "You do not have to do that," he said. "I know." They worked side by side until the sun climbed high. Days passed like that, quiet, steady. She helped with chores, cooked what little they had, and sometimes stared too long at the empty corner where her boys used to play. Hollis watched her without pushing. He never asked what had happened. He just stayed. One night, she sat on the cabin's front step, arms wrapped around her knees. Hollis came to sit beside her, same as he had the first time. "My boys," she said, voice low. They took them. Said I was not fit. Not proper. Like I was dirt on their boots. Hollis did not speak. Just reached over and set his hand over hers. His palm was warm and rough. She did not move. I raised them alone. Their father died in a mine collapse. Worked myself to bone to feed them. Guess it was not enough. It was more than enough, he said, voice rougher now. They were wrong. Francis turned, looked at him. His face was half in shadow, but his eyes were steady. You do not even know me. I know what I see. And what's that? A woman who was done wrong. A woman who did not quit. She stared at him for a long time, heart thudding like hooves in her chest. Why are you still here? She asked. He held her gaze. Because you are not unfit for any man. You are just too much for the wrong ones. The words hit something deep in her. She looked away, breath shaky. Then he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, careful and slow. She did not flinch. She leaned into it. When he kissed her, it was not sudden. It was like the closing of a long silence, gentle, sure, and full of everything they had not said out loud. Francis pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes. I am not easy, she whispered. I have been through too much. I do not want easy, Hollis said. I want you. She kissed him again, this time stronger, with all the heartbreak in her bones and all the hope left in her chest. That night, they lay in the narrow bed together, not out of desperation, not for shelter, but because something in them had started to heal. And when Hollis wrapped his arms around her, and Francis fell asleep with her head on his chest, it was the first time in years she did not dream of losing. The first snow came early that year, fine and dry like sifted flour, blown sideways across the range by a wind that never seemed to rest. Francis stood at the edge of the pasture, watching the cattle shift under the cottonwood trees, their breath fogging in the cold. Hollis was mending a split rail near the west fence, sleeves rolled despite the chill. He'd offered her gloves that morning. She'd taken them without a word. She stayed now because she wanted to. That truth settled quiet inside her, like the embers of a fire that had finally caught. Inside the cabin, she'd begun to make things hers in small ways, a pot of yellow beans soaking overnight, a strip of muslin hung for privacy near the wash basin, a coil of her mending thread tucked in a wooden bowl beside the hearth. Hollis didn't remark on any of it. He just made sure her chair near the fire stayed warm. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the snow turned gold, he came in with a cut on his forearm, a jagged line just below the elbow. Francis looked up from the hem she was stitching. What happened? Wire snapped. Caught me when I leaned in. She set the needle down without speaking and gestured for him to sit. She unfolded the cloth she kept for such things, boiled water, and cleaned the wound with hands that didn't shake. He watched her in silence until she began to wrap the bandage. You done this before? His voice was low, almost curious. My father was a blacksmith. Folks came to him for more than horseshoes, especially in winter. You miss him? I missed him when he was alive. He didn't ask more, just nodded once. That night, the wind picked up and hammered at the door. Francis lit a second lamp and moved her cot closer to the stove. Hollis stood near the window watching the trees bend. Storm's thickening, he said. She looked over. You ever think of leaving this place? He leaned his shoulder against the frame. Used to. Thought maybe I'd head further west, see the Pacific. But then I realized I wasn't chasing land. I was just trying to outrun something. And did you? No, he looked at her then. But I stopped needing to. She let the silence stretch between them, then folded her hands in her lap. I wrote a letter, she said, to the county office in Cheyenne. Asked about Jesse and Jonah. He stepped away from the window, slow and deliberate. You want to go see them? I don't know yet. I need to be sure I can offer them more than a roof with holes and a mother who can't keep them fed. He crouched beside her chair, resting his bandaged arm across his knee. You're not that woman anymore. I'm not sure the law sees it that way. Then let's show them something they can't ignore. She studied his face, the way the firelight caught the edge of his jaw. You offering me more than a cot by the stove? I'm offering whatever you want from me. There's no rush on it. Frances reached out and rested her hand on his. His skin was rough, calloused, but warm beneath her fingers. You don't owe me anything, Hollis. I know. Still want to give it. They stayed there until the wind settled into a low moan and the logs cracked in the hearth. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, she began sewing again, not for herself, but for trade. Hollis helped her carry bundles of stitched shirts and mended trousers to a ranch downriver. They came back with flour, salt, and a little sack of dried cherries he didn't mention until he dropped them in her hand. For your biscuits, he said, already walking past her. One evening, she handed him a folded shirt, clean cotton, hand-stitched seams, the collar straighter than any he'd worn before. You made this for me? He asked. She nodded. You've been walking around here like a half-dressed scarecrow. He smiled, slow and real. Reckon I deserved that. She turned to the stove, but he caught her wrist gently, just enough to stop her. I meant it, you know, about building something real, not just for now. Frances looked up, heart steady in her chest for the first time in years. I'm not afraid of hard work, she said. That's good, he replied, because I've got plans for spring. She raised a brow. Corral needs expanding, and I'm thinking about adding another room. She blinked, surprised. A room? For the boys, he said. The wind outside shifted again, but it didn't whistle so sharply anymore. Inside, the fire burned low and steady. She touched his arm, just above the bandage she'd changed that morning. Then I guess I'll keep sewing, she said. He kissed her then, slow and sure, like a man who knew what he was promising. And this time, she kissed him back without hesitation. The thaw came slow that spring. Snow lingered in the hollows long after the meadows turned wet and green, and the trails to Cheyenne were still thick with mud when Frances received a reply. The letter came folded neat, the envelope thin and creased, as if it had passed through a dozen hands before reaching hers. She stood by the barn when Hollis brought it from the post rider, the paper clutched in her fingers while the sun warmed her shoulders. They're placing them, she said quietly, eyes scanning the page. Some farm couple near Rawlins. They say it's permanent come June. Hollis didn't speak right away. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, watching her face. You want to fight it? I don't want them to think I gave up. Then let's show them you didn't. That night, she sat at the table with a fresh sheet of paper, hands steady as she wrote. Hollis carved notches into a length of pine, marking boards for the room he'd already started framing. Neither said much. They didn't need to. By mid-April, the cabin looked different. The added room had a window facing east, and Frances had scrubbed the floor until the raw wood shone. She stitched 2 feather pillows by lantern light, stuffing them with down from a trade she'd made with a woman upriver. Hollis cleared a path through the pasture, one wide enough for a wagon. You think they'll let you see them before the placement? He asked one morning, leaning on the fence while she shook out linens to dry. They said I could make a case, with proof of stability, a home, steady income. You want me there when you go? I do. He nodded, then added, we'll take the wagon next week, if the ground holds. She hesitated. You sure about this? I mean about them coming? I already built the room. That's not the same as raising them. I never said it was. But I've got 2 hands and a good back. If they'll have me, I'll do right by him. She studied him then, the way he looked her in the eye and didn't flinch. They don't trust easy, especially Jesse. They don't have to. Not yet. The journey to Cheyenne took 2 days. They slept one night under the wagon, with Hollis rising early to check the axle and Frances walking off the stiffness in her legs. She wore the gray wool dress she'd saved from before, with a new hem and a patched cuff. When they reached the courthouse steps, the clerk barely glanced up until he saw the official stamp on her letter. "You've come a ways," he said, squinting at Hollis. "This your husband?" Hollis didn't correct him. "We're here to petition for custody," Frances said. The man gestured toward a bench. "Judge is in session, but you'll be heard before noon." She sat with her hands folded, boots still dusty, her jaw set. Hollis rested beside her, quiet as ever, hat in his lap, eyes on the floor. When her name was called, they rose together. The judge was older now, the same one who'd signed the order that took her boys. His eyes narrowed when he saw her, then shifted toward Hollis. "You've brought a witness?" "I've brought the man who built the home they'll return to," she said. They asked her questions about income, provisions, schooling. She answered them all without hesitation. Hollis spoke only when asked, his words plain, his tone calm. "He's not their father," the judge said after a pause. "No," Frances replied, "but he's the man who stayed." There was no applause, no dramatic pause. Just a scrape of the judge's pen and the low murmur of clerks at their desks. "You'll have a supervised visit," the judge said. "We'll evaluate after." They found the boys in a small room lined with shelves. Jesse stood near the window, taller than she remembered, his shoulders drawn tight. Jonah sat on the floor, clutching a wooden horse with a cracked leg. Frances knelt. "Hi," she said gently. Jesse looked at her without speaking. Jonah blinked, then rushed forward, burying his face in her coat. "You came," he whispered. "I told you I would." Jesse didn't move. Hollis stepped forward, stopping at a respectful distance. "Mornin', boys." Jesse glanced up at him, wary. "Who's that?" Frances met his gaze. "Someone who helped me find the way back to you." Jonah looked up at Hollis. "You got horses?" "I do. Can I ride one?" "If your mama says it's all right." Jesse didn't speak, but his fingers twitched, like he was holding something back. "You don't have to decide today," Frances said softly. "But the house is there, warm, with your names already on the wall." Jonah grinned. Jesse didn't, but his eyes flicked toward Hollis, then away. The visit ended too soon. They walked out into the pale afternoon light, the wind tugging at Frances's sleeves. She stood beside the wagon, watching the courthouse doors. "I don't know if they'll come," she said. "They will." "How can you be sure?" "Because you didn't stop." She turned toward him. "Neither did you. Wasn't ever planning to." They rode back in silence, the wagon leaning soft into the hills. A week later, a rider came up the path near dawn. Hollis met him at the edge of the pasture. Frances stood on the porch, apron still dusted with flour. The man handed over a paper, nodded once, and turned his horse. Hollis read it, then walked to her, slow. "You'll need to make up 2 more beds," he said. Frances pressed a hand to her chest. "They're coming." "They are." She didn't cry. She simply leaned into him, her breath catching once as she closed her eyes. And when he held her, it was not in comfort or promise or apology. It was in welcome. The wagon creaked slow over the rise, dust rising behind its wheels as the prairie opened wide around it. Frances stood in the doorway of the cabin, apron in one hand, the other shading her eyes. The boys were seated side by side on the bench, a worn satchel between them. Jesse's shoulders stayed stiff, jaw set. Jonah leaned forward, gripping the rail with both hands, eyes wide with the kind of wonder only children carried. Hollis came up from the lower field, wiping his palms on his trousers. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Francis stepped down the 3 porch steps and waited as the wagon stopped. The driver tipped his hat, nodded, then helped the boys down. Francis crouched, heart thudding like a low drumbeat, and opened her arms. Jonah ran first, full tilt, burying his face against her chest. Jesse followed slower, his eyes scanning the yard, the cabin, Hollis standing quiet near the fence. "You remember me?" Francis asked, brushing Jonah's hair back from his brow. "Course I do," he mumbled. She looked up at Jesse. "You hungry?" He shrugged. "A little." "Well, that's something," she said, standing. Inside, the boys took cautious steps, eyes darting from the braided rug at the hearth to the shelf of tin cups. Francis had laid out 2 quilts on the beds in the new room, stitched with care through late nights while the wind rattled the shutters. Jonah dropped his satchel by the door and wandered to the table. "You got pie?" Francis chuckled as she untied her apron. "Not yet, but we've got sugar and dried cherries. You help me pit 'em, I'll show you the rest." Jesse followed her into the kitchen corner, running a hand over the edge of the counter. "You build this?" "No," she said, "but I made it better." Hollis leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Jesse looked at him, then looked away. "You break horses?" Jesse asked, voice flat. "Sometimes." "You any good?" Hollis tilted his head. "Most days." Jesse didn't smile, but he nodded once, like he was filing the answer away. That evening, they ate stew at the table, Jonah's feet swinging above the floor, Jesse's spoon moving slow but steady. Francis sat between them, her own bowl untouched for a long while. After supper, Hollis pulled his old fiddle down from the shelf. He didn't play often and never for show, but that night he tuned the strings and set the bow across them. The sound was rough at first, then softened, settling into a tune that carried the warmth of firelight with it. Jonah leaned into his mother's side, whispering, "I like it here." Jesse didn't say anything, but he didn't leave the room. Later, after both boys lay asleep under quilts stitched with their names, Francis stood on the porch beside Hollis. The moon hung low, casting pale light over the pasture. "You all right?" he asked, voice low. "I don't know what I expected," she said. "They've been through more than they should have. Jesse doesn't trust easy. That won't change overnight. I can wait." Francis turned toward him. "You never asked for any of this." "I never needed to." She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Do you think we'll be enough for them?" she asked. "We already are." He kissed her temple, slow and sure, then rested his forehead against hers. Inside, the fire burned low. The quilts didn't shift. Outside, the wind ran soft through the grass, and for the first time in a long while, nothing felt uncertain. In early May, the high plains wind softened and the creek behind the pasture began to run clear again. Francis stood beneath the cottonwood by the east fence, a willow basket hooked over her arm, watching as Jesse and Jonah chased each other through the grass. Their laughter carried on the breeze. It was the first time she'd heard them let loose like that since coming home. She didn't call it out, not wanting to break the spell, but she tucked the sound away inside her, where the old pain used to sit. Inside, Hollis had spread a ledger open across the table, pencil in hand. He was tracking seed orders and grazing rotation, but his eyes lifted when Francis stepped through the door. "They're starting to settle in," she said, setting the basket down. "They're boys. They'll find their feet faster than we will." She crossed to the stove, checked the kettle. "Jesse asked me this morning if he could learn to handle the gelding. Not ride yet, just brush him. I told him he'd need to ask you." Hollis pushed the pencil behind his ear. He did. Yesterday. I told him he could, long as he watched how I do it first. Francis turned, surprised. He didn't tell me that. He's been learning how to ask for things without using words. Must take after you. She narrowed her eyes at him, but there was warmth in it now. You're getting too comfortable saying things like that. That's what happens when a man knows where he stands. She moved to him, rested her hand against his shoulder. And where's that? With you. They didn't speak more on it. They didn't need to. That Sunday, a traveling minister stopped at the neighboring ranch and word spread down the valley. Francis didn't usually hold fast to church hours, but she washed the boys' shirts and let them wear their boots in the house. Hollis hitched the wagon and wore the shirt she'd sewn for him months ago, the blue one with the button she'd had to replace twice already. The service was held under the open sky, the congregation small but familiar. Francis sat beside Hollis with Jonah pressed against her side and Jesse leaning forward, elbows on his knees. After the last hymn, neighbors came to greet them. Mrs. Kincaid brought a jar of early preserves, and old Mr. Redding asked after their pasture fencing. One woman, Mrs. Leclerc, paused to speak with Francis alone while the children ran ahead. I remember when they took them from you, she said gently. There were some of us who didn't agree with it. Francis kept her shoulders straight. I didn't need agreement. I needed someone to help me stop it. Mrs. Leclerc nodded slowly. Well, it's been set right now. You've made something strong here. Francis watched Jesse climb the fence rail and drop down on the other side, landing light. I had help. That night, once the boys were asleep, she and Hollis sat on the porch. The stars were out in full, the kind of night sky that made a person feel both small and held. I've been thinking, he said after a long stretch of quiet. She turned toward him. Never a good start. He smiled, slow and thoughtful. There's a preacher coming through again next month. Could ask him to stop by the cabin. Francis didn't answer right away. She looked out over the pasture, at the moonlight catching the tops of the grass. I never imagined I'd marry again. You wouldn't be marrying again, he said. You'd be marrying me. She looked back at him, and there was nothing uncertain in her gaze. You sure you want a woman with 2 sons, a sharp tongue, and no proper dowry? I didn't ask for proper. I asked for you. She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his, and leaned her head against his shoulder. The old fears had gone quiet. In their place lived something steady as earth. They were married the first Sunday in June. The ceremony was small, just the boys, a few neighbors, and the preacher who arrived dusty and smiling. Francis wore a dress she'd let out at the seams, and Jesse held Jonah's hand to keep him from fidgeting. Hollis stood like he always did, quiet, firm, with his eyes only on her. Afterward they ate biscuits and honey under the cottonwood, and Jonah fell asleep in the grass with a cookie still in his hand. Jesse stayed close, not clinging but not drifting far either. That night, with the boys tucked into their room and the fire down to embers, Francis and Hollis stood in the doorway watching the wind move through the tall grass. Feels like we've come a long way, she said. We have. She turned to him, her hand resting over his heart. You still mean to keep me? For all the years I get. And the boys? He smiled then, not wide, just enough. They're ours now. She kissed him, slow and certain. And when they stepped back inside, it was not into a cabin, but into a home built by their own hands. Years later, the pasture still ran green every spring, and the boys grew tall under the same roof that once sheltered their mother's grief. Jesse took to horses like he'd been born to it, and Jonah, always one to ask questions, learned his letters beside the stove while Francis read aloud from the old books they traded for. Hollis never stopped rising early. Francis never stopped stitching. and neither of them ever forgot the ache of what they had survived to find one another. They grew old in that house, side by side, with no need for grand words or promises made twice. Their love lived in the work, in the long silences filled with understanding, in the way he always poured her coffee first, and she always left the lamp burning when he came in late from the field. And in that quiet, steady life, they found a happiness that never needed proving.